I imagine at one time you were this brilliant little child. As we enter into adulthood, what was brilliant in childhood can actually get in the way of you living the life you want to live. Hello, friends. I'm Nancy Houston. I want to help you live a better life. We're all emotional creatures who sometimes think. And so it's so important that we make this journey from our heads into the depths of our hearts. Welcome to the In-Between with Nancy Houston. Good morning, everybody. I am so happy to have a very special guest with us today, Cooper Davis. Can't wait to learn more about you, Cooper. And I think we're going to talk about something that I hope everybody listening to can relate to in one way or another. So let's just dive into this conversation. So, Cooper, thank you for being our guest today. Thank you for joining us on the In-Between. We call it the In-Between because, let's face it, we are living in the in-between, trying to figure out our lives as we go, sometimes not knowing where we're going specifically, but we know we're trying to, we're meant to climb up a hill, so we're trying to move forward. And it can get real discouraging when we're feeling just stuck and like we're just circling round and round and round. And so that's why we wanted to have you on as a guest. I heard an interview on YouTube with you, and it was so good. And I just appreciated your honesty and your vulnerability and your willingness to talk about your experience and what you're doing now and how your experience gave you a passion to talk about what we are going to talk about. So everybody
Totally.
get ready. Put on your listening ears because here we go. So, Cooper, where I'd like to start is currently. What are you doing currently? And then we'll get into the why, like why you have a passion for this, how you got to this place.
That's great. And oftentimes I'm asked to start at the beginning. So this is refreshing.
Oh, good.
Um, because you can also I love the concept of your podcast to begin with. I totally relate to that in between period when you are living an important part of your life, even if it's painful, but
Yeah.
it's impossible to understand like how that ultimately is going to play out in context until you get to your future. Um,
Isn't Cooper, I just love what you just said. Like,
mhm.
I love what you said. And it's so true. When you're in the middle of a mess, you're like, how could this someday be something, my suffering be something useful?
Yeah,
And yet,
yeah,
I know my suffering has ended up being useful, and I know yours has too. So I'm
yeah,
glad you're excited to tell us about your current and how you.
yeah. Well, I can tell you, we can work backwards. So at this moment, I mean, like everyone else, I do a few different things. But if you were to go to, I think I have a LinkedIn page. If you were to go there,
Yeah.
it would mostly uh, what I do is I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Inner Compass Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And Inner Compass, which has been around 8 or 9 years, depending on how you define the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, and most of what we have done to date and will continue to do is help people, like individuals, families. Um, Sometimes we are help mental health professionals, although that's not our primary audience. We have a lot of them use our resources, make more informed choices around starting or stopping psychiatric drugs, more informed choices, and sort of like think a little more deeply about the usefulness of their own diagnoses that they may have received over the years. And of particular emphasis, I would say, is we have, up until this moment, been one of a shockingly small number of organizations or resources that are focused on a harm reduction approach to
Mm.
psychiatric drug tapering and withdrawal.
Ooh, that's so good.
That's changing, I can
Mhm,
say. Finally, that is changing, and you are starting to see more so in the United Kingdom, but it's
mhm.
starting to happen over here where people with more clinical expertise are realizing the urgent need we have for being able to help people safely come off these drugs if that's something that they decide to do.
Yeah.
Um, but for a long time, it was left up to layperson communities to figure that out. So maybe most famously, there's a forum called Surviving Antidepressants,
Mm.
which is in a lot of ways kind of like the mothership in all of this. Um, but certainly our website, which handles it a little bit differently, and we're at theinnercompass.org. Um, we there's a handful of other people, and there's sort of this whole, I don't know what you would call it. Some people call it a burgeoning cottage industry. I would say it's a little bit more of you know, a movement.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
more to it than just an industry, but there is kind of a whole ecosystem landscape of people who are helping one another,
Mhm.
whether they're coming off their drugs or not, or just thinking about it, or just sort of navigating
Yeah.
the difficulty that often get categorized as mental health challenges. More and more
Mhm.
people are turning to others who have been through it,
Mm.
um, not for advice, not, to tell them what to do, certainly not to be prescriptive, but rather to speak from a place of experience, in the 12-step world, which operates on a similar set of principles. We talk about experience,
Yeah.
strength, and hope.
Yeah.
And that's very relevant in a mental health
Oh,
context, right? I
oh,
mean,
that's so good, Cooper. I mean, isn't it wonderful instead of these topics being so surrounded by shame,
mm,
instead, let's de-shame them so we can have helpful, hopeful conversations around
hmm
them and we can learn from each other's experiences. I've
hmm
got a client right now who just decided, I'm getting off these psychotropic drugs. I'm done. I'm getting off. And so he just stopped cold turkey. And then a few days
oof,
later, he finds himself in the emergency room and he's just, oh my gosh, it was terrifying for him. And he
hmm
didn't understand it. He didn't understand what's wrong with me. Why can't I just stop? And I'm like, what if there's nothing wrong with you? What if you've just been on some really powerful drugs? And we've got to find a gentle and a kind way of doing this where it doesn't end up causing you more harm, right?
hmm
So anyway,
hmm
I love what you are doing. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. And I hope you're right that it's becoming a movement, not just a cottage industry. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I just to say about, the young man you just mentioned, I think one thing I try to say every chance I get,
Hmm.
um, this whole issue of withdrawal
Yeah.
and the need to taper, the fact that that is not, we have many stories, right? You can go and see stories of people experiencing, all kinds of different conditions, like in the realm of mental health or addiction. You can read about it in the newspaper. You can see movies that have dramatizations of it. It's in TV shows. Within
Yeah.
our culture, we have all these sort of examples of these really real and, sometimes they're overly dramatic or they're
Mhm.
distorting, but at least it's sort of reifies for the general public that there's something there's a pattern to how these types of traumas and dramas tend to play out in our culture. That
Yeah.
has not yet really happened for the issue of psychiatric drug withdrawal, despite
Mm.
the fact that there are many, many people who have been on these drugs and have been on them for a long time.
Mhm.
And I'd say, I would define a long time is however long it takes for your body and your mind to sort of um, adapt to their presence, the presence of those drugs. And so
Yeah.
you actually see some changes, biologically, certainly psychologically, that's a different kind of thing. But in this case, the cost of not having easily accessible narratives in our culture about this is that when people like your client decide to come off, they're not going into that with a sense in mind of how this could go or how this generally goes or often goes for other people making similar choices. So then when they encounter what often are withdrawal symptoms, like this is basic, what goes up must come down, you
Yeah.
know, the body adapts to
Mhm.
what it encounters on a daily basis, certainly over months, definitely over years. So when they encounter what are if he was taking heroin,
Mhm.
everybody would know
Mhm.
that that's withdrawal, that
Yeah.
some portion of what he's dealing with is withdrawal and should be treated as such,
Yeah.
meaning it can be managed, it can be planned for, it can be supported.
Mhm.
There's different ways to approach it, and it can be transitory and temporary. So many
Mm.
people find themselves instead going through this experience, and both they and their prescriber
Mhm.
get this sense, oh, there's my underlying mental illness popping up. I better
Yeah,
get back on my drug. So
that's
not only
exactly right.
not only does it keep them on this drug that they may not actually need to be on
Yeah.
because again, these responses can be temporary, it also sort of, reifies for them, for their family, for their prescriber. That was awful. Let's not go through that again. Right. Maybe we need to bring our dose actually up instead of talking about
Yes.
coming off of this. And that's
That is so
totally,
good.
totally rational to
Oh,
make that assumption. So that's why I'm always, not to derail you here, but I'm always trying to make sure that we can say as often as possible that like this, in a lot of ways, if you're concerned about the overall rate of medicalization of these experiences that we call, mental illness and just the rate of prescription, especially with younger people, this is a huge reason why, because the people who might have chosen to come off of them don't think that they can.
yeah.
They don't necessarily know what they're
Mhm.
looking at when they try and things go off the rails.
Yeah.
So that's one of my little speeches. So thank you for indulging me, Nancy.
That is a great speech that I'm so glad you gave to us because isn't that what we do? We can so fragilize ourselves,
Hmm.
others, and then reiterate like, this is probably a sign that you actually need more, or that you've got to stay on it, or we can't handle you going through withdrawals. We need you to be okay. And the person may go, yeah, I need to be okay too. And so we can go for the quick, like, okay, then let's keep doing what we're doing or adding to it, instead of like, yeah, no, this is going to be hard and messy. You're going to go through withdrawal. And sure,
Hmm.
we want to find the safest, healthiest way for you to do that. And let's try to do it kindly and gently. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you're probably going to feel yucky for a while, and there's going to be some symptoms as your body and your mind readjust. And in the meantime, let's try to just hold that steady. Sometimes I think that's my role. Like, hey, you're really okay. And this is
Hmm.
going to be a process. And at times you're going to feel bad in the process. But a lot of this is, how are you going to talk to yourself to get yourself through this? Because
Yeah.
I believe that you can and you will, you know,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
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 So, and then, we always, then there's beliefs we have to deal with. Like for a lot of people, it's like, well, my parent had a lot of depression, and anxiety, and I do too. And they couldn't really get their act together, and neither can I. And I'm like, well, but what if you could, if you just learned some skills? What if this
Hmm.
is more about skill building than about, some of that learned helplessness that
Hmm.
that we can all have, right?
Hmm.
I like will observe myself. I'm like, oh, Nancy, that's just an area of learned helplessness for you. How about if you actually
Hmm.
learned how to change a tire? I mean, you know what I mean, right?
Well, one
So
one of the things that we talk about, because I do some coaching, I'm not a clinician, but just because of my own experiences that
yeah.
brought me to this work, um, that's what I speak from. And for some people, it is helpful, the framing of like, big changes are hard. Life is hard to begin with. If you've been
Yeah.
on these drugs for a long period of time and they've, been something that have really helped you do things, achieve things, or at least they feel like they've been helpful.
Hmm.
Whether they remain helpful over time is another question. But, in my own experience, um, I was on a number of different psychiatric drugs for a while. One of the I started with stimulants, and they had an enormous positive impact on my life when I was younger, the very
Yeah.
beginning. And then for a long time, I lived with this story of, well, I can't maintain this life that I've built for myself unless I have access to these drugs because they allow me to be a version of myself that can
Hmm.
actually keep all these plates spinning and keep all of what I've built going.
Yeah.
And on some level, there was a truth to that. But I
Hmm.
think what I, in hindsight, think a lot about is the hardest parts for me of sort of like going through that midlife transition from having one particular way of living to something totally different, with almost a clean break in between, right?
Hmm.
Which some people call that recovery or whatever. I think there's lots of different ways we think about it. But
Yeah.
when I look back, what I see is that when I went through something really, really hard, it forced certain skills and abilities to emerge out of me that were not maybe being called forward
Hmm.
previously. And then once things started to level out more, just because time's passing, it's not because I
Yeah.
got my arms around the problem as much as like
Right.
time goes by. And so those emergent gifts and skills and capacities that came out in a time of crisis, I get to keep those and trust that they're there, and then continue to use those and develop those later on in life when things aren't so life or death, right?
Mm.
When I just
Hmm.
have to, do much more simple stuff. And I think for some people, that's a that's a useful doorway into like this question of what use do I have of the suffering that I'm going through
Yeah.
right now? What
Yeah.
possibly could be the point of
Yes.
this, right?
Cooper, that's so good. It's like that reframing that is masterful and is life changing. When we believe that I'm too fragile to suffer,
Yeah.
and so and then the world is sad, so in some ways, so you medicate that, you
Hmm.
know, or you treat that like there's something wrong with you instead of what if there's nothing wrong with you? What if this is life? And
Hmm.
life is filled with a certain amount of suffering. And we have to believe that as we are able to endure some suffering, we're also building this beautiful resiliency.
Yeah.
It's the only way we build what is it called, the cingulate cortex of our brain, like is to do hard things. And the
Hmm.
more we do hard things, the more we're building this part of our brain. And,
Hmm.
I know for me, Cooper, so I actually I mean, I know we misuse the word trauma a lot in the world we live
Hmm.
in. It's been used for absolutely everything. Um, I actually grew up in a home where my father had severe PTSD from World War II, and then he had a brain injury from being bucked off. He rode rodeo after the war,
Wow.
you know, and then he threw in a lot of alcohol, and he had a brain on fire, right?
Hmm.
And so because of that, he could be wonderful and delightful, and he could be traumatizing and terrifying. And so when I got into my 30s, I had to start. I just went through this time where I'm like, something's wrong with me, and I feel really depressed. And I never really felt that way before. And so, as my gynecologist said, you need to get on an antidepressant.
Hmm.
So I got on Prozac for 9 months. Thank goodness at the same time, I was going to therapy. And, I just had to unpack my childhood. I had to do the work. And finally, after like 9 months, I'm like, I feel kind of flat. And so I'm going to go off this. And I think now I know that this is just hard work and I just have to do the hard work.
Yeah.
And so I didn't like the flat feeling. I didn't feel, I had four little boys and I didn't feel like I was as available or as present as I wanted to be. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm like, I'm going to go off this because I've learned that I'm just going to have to do my grief work. I'm going to have to go through the memories and I'm going to have to do that one way or another. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So I might as well just do it. And I did it and I got through it.
Yeah.
And it's made me extremely resilient and also caused me to believe in the resiliency of humans. Like
Yeah.
we are so resilient if we give ourselves a little bit of credit, and
Yeah.
realize that hard things can actually really work for our good. I heard Jordan Peterson say, um, what if what was once toxic in your life could become a tonic to the world?
Yeah.
And that's like one of my favorite statements.
It's
And it's
beautiful.
true. And you've lived through that, and I have too. Okay, so tell us, so when you were younger,
Hmm.
you were put on ADHD medication, or you decided that that's what you needed, or tell us about that.
So I was first diagnosed with, back then it was ADD.
Yeah,
Um, the H existed, but they were different things.
yeah, true.
So I was diagnosed with ADD in first grade, so that would have been about 1991, which is around the time that there was like sort of that first big wave of ADD diagnosis, and certainly Ritalin prescriptions for younger kids, especially boys.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
I was diagnosed um, a couple times in first grade, and then in subsequent years, continued, from what I understand, to meet the criteria for that diagnosis. Um, Mostly the reason I was in uh, in a doctor's office in the first place was because I had, what they would call behavior issues. In
Mhm,
hindsight, I wasn't in a great school.
mhm,
I also, I mean, I'm sure I didn't make things easy, but at that time, unruly or difficult to control kids, especially boys,
mhm,
it was
mhm.
very much in vogue to help them
Yes, very much.
with by medicating them. So my parents said no. They
Mhm,
said we're not doing it.
mhm,
They were quite crunchy, like they ran a food co-op like out of our garage. We were, my mom always worked at health food stores and herb gardens and this kind of thing. So it was never going to happen. She
right,
had her skepticism about it, but what they settled on was, look, when you're 18, you can make that decision for yourself.
yeah,
Okay, but we're not going to do it. For which I am very grateful to them. I will say that it was actually when I was 17, I ended up having my first like general physical with a doctor
mhm.
without my mom. So
Oh,
she,
yeah,
she
yeah,
was still working. She, I can only get you an after school appointment. You need to go see Dr. Livingston, like by yourself. You can figure this out, pal. Like whatever. So I did, and when I was there, I was like, oh, geez, I guess I can. I don't know. Tell him that I have ADD and see if he wants to put me on Ritalin, which he did.
yeah,
Um, and I will say, as I alluded to earlier in the conversation, when I first went on stimulants, I I went overnight from a C student to an A student.
mhm,
Um, I My whole academic career prior to this was does not work to potential, all of that kind of thing. That classic ADD boy report cards. That's what I had.
yeah,
And
yeah,
now all of a sudden, not because of skill building, not because of, fixing other issues in the home or whatever,
right,
not
yeah,
because of getting off food dyes. I had been off food dyes the whole time. So it was none of that. It was
right,
because of this stimulant drug that I was taking twice a day that I found my way to being a really strong academic
Mhm.
performer.
Mhm.
And it had other effects. It had effects on me socially. It had other effects that didn't matter as much at that time. As
Mhm.
time went on, my tolerance grew, and the context in which I was needing to function were changing, and I had more and more autonomy.
Yeah.
um, I was getting more mixed results. But at the very
Mm.
beginning, and that was when, I was probably I want to say I was a sophomore in high school.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe I was a junior, somewhere in there. But that's a pretty formative time in my sense. Like my big takeaway was when I take this drug, it is far easier
Mhm.
and almost sometimes enjoyable for me
Yeah.
to do the things that the adults in my life want me to do very, very badly.
Oh, yes, good point, good point. Mhm.
And then and so I very much internalized at that age that I didn't have this narrative of like, oh, I'm defective per se.
Mhm.
Um, I thought I did have, like, even at that age, somewhat of a critique of the school system, and like, this is not a natural environment, and if I'm in a different type of situation, I don't have any, quote unquote issues. So I sort
Yeah.
of knew that. And so my thinking at the time was, this helps me function in these kinds of environments, which I am not evolved to do well in, and is not
Yes.
necessarily making me a bad person, but it is creating a lot of frustration for me and for the people in my life. And so all of that kind of goes away as long as I take these drugs. And yeah, I have, when they start to wear off, I don't like how I feel.
Mhm.
I don't like sort of the rebound effects if I
Mhm.
am not taking them for a few days and have to go to school
Mhm.
unmedicated. And so why not just take these for the rest of my life? And I had an uncle
Yeah.
who was taking stimulants at the same time and was
Yeah.
sort of like trying to do his best to almost mentor me or shepherd me into the ways and knowings of the ADD man,
Wow.
which, I have mixed reviews about how well of a job he did. So anyway, I can fast forward just a little bit. So you know, in total, I was on what started as stimulants. Eventually, I had benzodiazepines. Eventually, had sleep drugs,
Mhm.
gabapentinoids.
Mhm.
Um, like I really went through the gamut
Yeah.
of different
Yeah.
drugs. All of those were off label,
Mm.
um,
Mhm.
or they were like very specifically being prescribed, sort of that prescription cascade to manage, the benzodiazepine was added because of the difficulties I was having as my tolerance went up for stimulants and I'm taking higher and higher doses. The come downs were worse, just the anxiety while on them was worse. Um,
Yes.
and so, I don't think that my prescribers were imagining that. I hope they weren't
Mhm.
imagining that I suddenly spontaneously had an anxiety disorder emerge that had nothing to do with the like 60 milligrams of Adderall I was taking. Like
Oh,
I think they
wow.
sort of knew, and
Yeah.
they knew that I knew that, like, this is just to help.
Yeah.
Stimulants are so important, so rather than backing off on those, let's do what we can to, take the edges off.
Oh,
And
wow.
and that's how I ended up, bouncing in between those two drugs, moving around to um at some point I was on um clonidine
Mm.
and Lyrica and all these different things to
Oh,
take the
wow.
place of the benzos, but then the benzos would come back, and
Mhm.
eventually that led to me, being kind of, not super healthy, physically
Yeah.
not healthy,
Yeah.
um, which led to depression symptoms. So then the
Mhm.
antidepressants come in, and now I'm really all over the place with the polypharmacy. So why not a mood stabilizer to smooth it all out? Um, and then eventually I determined, you know, 13 years later that this experiment has not been a success. Like,
Wow,
and the
Cooper.
world had to really beat me over the head with that truth before
Yeah.
I internalized it. And so I ended up at that point coming off, and I personally, because back then, as is the case now, there are so few resources for people whose experience in relation to these drugs is prescribed.
Hmm.
The best place for me that was available to me was like an old school 12-step rehab,
Hmm. Hmm.
inpatient rehab.
Yeah.
Um, and and yet it was not a great fit in a lot of really important ways, right?
Right.
There are things about that program that were phenomenally useful,
Yeah.
and I credit it with all the good things that have happened in my life since then. They
Hmm.
started in those rooms.
Hmm.
Um, but then there were things that just like were a complete mismatch,
Hmm.
that are
Hmm.
not the same. It was not a pure sort like story of addiction. It was something
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I'm just sort of like buzzing through here, but that was my major arc, and then I had to kind of start fresh
Yeah.
um at age 30 and figure out, what comes next. How am I going to do
Yeah.
this? Who am I?
Yeah.
Where'd all my friends go? I thought you guys thought I was
Oh,
funny.
yeah.
After a while it wasn't funny anymore.
Mm.
And I
Right.
didn't care until I was like totally kind of like through the hardest parts of coming off these drugs and then having to take inventory of what my life had become, which
Wow.
was not what I had expected.
Wow. Cooper, 13 years. Then you wake up and you're almost 30 and it's like, who am I? Where am I? What's happened to my life and
Yeah.
my friends and my relationships? And wow, it took a lot of courage for you to go into a program. And even though it didn't, your story didn't fit the narrative completely, and yet it helped you start doing an evaluation of your life.
Yeah.
That took a lot of courage. I just want to say I'm super proud of you for doing it.
That's very nice, Nancy. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm proud of me too. And I
Yeah.
will I will say for anybody who's in the middle of huge upheaval, there's a
Yeah.
very good chance that you will look back at yourself during the time when you feel the most unimpressive you've ever felt, and
Mhm.
look back and be and just marvel, like, how did I get through that? How did
Yeah.
I know which way to go? Like, I look
Yeah.
back at those really difficult years, and I wonder if I could even do it now,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's even when you feel like a total mess, and I certainly did, and you don't know which way is up, and you're filled with regrets,
Mhm.
just enduring that
Mhm.
is so, so valuable.
Mhm.
And, I wonder when I look at people, I marvel
Yeah.
at what people are capable of.
Oh, me too. And what you were capable of. Isn't it beautiful? I know it's so gut-wrenching when we hit bottom,
Yeah.
but it's the beginning.
Yeah.
And to let ourselves go there and go, "Oh, I think I've hit my bottom." And and to know, like, for me, like, that day I realized, like, "Oh my gosh, I gotta deal with my past." And
Yeah.
I've run as hard and fast as I can from it. And I did it a lot by, getting married young, having a lot of babies. I'm glad I did. I love it. It's such a great, such a great. And then, I just drive myself too hard every day.
Yeah.
Just drive myself like a slave.
Yeah.
And which is really common, being a pleaser and then a driver when you've had some stuff that you need to deal with and you don't want to. Um, but I love it when we hit bottom. And what I did the day after realizing that I'd hit my bottom, that I couldn't
Hmm.
outrun this anymore, is the next day I knew a counselor and I reached out and I said, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just know there's something wrong with me and I know I need help. And so,
Mm-hmm.
there's no perfect help, right? I mean, there just isn't because we're all
Mm-hmm.
people and we're all messy and we're all imperfect. But man, I started going to therapy every Monday at 1 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
Went for years, and then I got into some groups because whatever our history is, it happened in community,
Yeah.
and we get better in
Yeah.
community. And
Yes.
it's not going to be a perfect like you going to a 12 step. It's like, yeah, it's not perfect, doesn't fit your narrative completely, and
Yeah.
yet just getting into community and saying, hey, here's my story,
Yeah.
and here's where I feel kind of fragmented and lost, and I don't know how to get out of this freaking tunnel I'm in, but there's got to be an exit. And maybe I
Yeah.
could learn from some of you and you could kind of show me the way and maybe take my hand for a few minutes and lead me closer to where there might be a little light, at the end of this tunnel. And
Yeah.
so,
What, let me, one thing that I am really grateful for being, because I gravitated towards Alcoholics Anonymous, not
yeah,
because I ever had an alcohol problem, but because that's where there tended to be the most long-term sobriety.
yeah,
Um, and one of the things, so like as I'm trying to reimagine who I am outside of this highly psychiatrized,
mm,
late, teenagerhood into early adulthood, I'm trying to figure this out, and my mentors are these hard-boiled New England alcoholic men. Okay.
right?
And I remember that when I first got to that rehab, I called my dad. I said, Dad, you got to get me out of here. There's been a
Yeah,
terrible mistake. Okay. This is not where I'm supposed to be. Like, I'm
right?
like on Mars here. And he said, well, just hang in there and see if you can make any friends. Um, which I did that, and I am sure glad that I stayed. And one thing that you hear in AA are all these little like sayings
Yeah,
that no mental health professional is ever going to say to you in a million years, and
yeah,
that you might not even hear in a support group,
uh-huh.
because one of them was like this guy in like a thick Boston accent telling me like, I got news for you, buddy. Your problems are not special,
Oh,
okay?
that's
You
so good. That's
you
so
think
good.
you think that you're like terminally unique and there's just
Yes,
no solution for all your little problems because they're so special. But his thing was like all the details you're focused on, like zoom out. At the end of the day, it's kind of the same five or six major issues that everybody in this place is dealing with in different ways. And for some people, it's
um,
alcohol, and for some people, it's psychiatry, and for other
uh-huh,
people, it's something totally different. And at the end of the day, you're still dealing with human relationships, the
yeah,
challenges of being alive, the challenges of not being able to know the future, challenges of trusting other people, knowing
mhm,
when to trust yourself, blah, blah, blah. There's not a whole lot of different kind of stories here. And that was something that I desperately needed to hear, because one of the things that can happen in mental health world more generally, I'm not really talking about psychiatry as much here, but just
yeah, yeah,
there is this, I'm sure you see this too. I mean, there's this unending appetite for analysis.
yes,
How did this
yes,
happen? Right? How
yes,
did this happen? Why is this happening? The how and the
oh,
why. But really, what I learned in 12-step world, and I really believe this is true for most people. The important question is not why did this come to pass? The important
right,
question is how do I endure it while
that's
it's
right.
really hard?
Oh my
Like
gosh, Cooper,
in this moment, right?
that is so good. Thank you for saying that. I mean, s- I'm just relating to you so much. Like, I didn't go down the road of drugs and alcohol because I'd watched my dad go down that road.
Hmm.
And so, man, like I'm not touching that stuff. I mean, I did a little bit. I got drunk a few times in high school, of course, but
Sure.
tried pot, a normal
Hmm.
teenager. But I'm like, that's not the road I can go down. Um, Nonetheless, I did a 12-step program as well. And because I think I was addicted to the drama trauma.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And I love it because one of the things that they really teach you is like, hey, you know what? Let's say you're driving down the road and you get hit by a drunk driver and your leg is all busted up. It wasn't your fault. You still got to take your hiney to the hospital and
Yep.
have surgery and put in a cast, and then you got to go to rehab for who knows how long, and that's on you. And it's like, I think that's the beauty of like 12 step, is what this Boston man was saying, is like, hey dude, this is your life, and at some point you're gonna have to own it, instead of who are we gonna pin this on, who are we gonna
Yep.
pin this on. And you're right, that is honestly, like, as a therapist for 20 some years, that is what I had to start really waking up to. It's like, okay, I mean, I can appreciate we need to unpack some of the things that happened in your childhood, no doubt. How that impacted you, how that formed you, how that shaped you. Nonetheless, end of the day,
Yeah.
I gotta own me. I gotta own, this is my one beautiful, glorious life to live. And how am I going to live it? Am I going to spend my life blaming others, addicted to the drama, and blaming it
Hmm.
all on trauma, or am I going to own me? And I love what he said to you, like, hey, dude, life is hard, man. Life is hard. You're not the
Hmm.
only one. And there's
Hmm.
something, did you find that comforting to learn? Like, I found that such a comfort, like, oh, I'm not the only one who experienced like sexual trauma
Hmm.
or domestic trauma, or I'm not the only one. Like, there's boatloads of people out there who've experienced the same thing and lived through it, and they're, you know, they learned how to deal with
Hmm.
it. And so can I, you know?
It was, first hearing it was hard for me
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
because and I think when you're somebody who has gone through some significant stuff and who has been struggling to find your way out of it,
Yeah.
and there's we become really I won't say comfortable, but the familiarity of these like sort of
Yes.
knots. We're working on these knots, right?
Yes, we
That
are.
they
Yeah.
just don't seem to untangle, and every time you pull on this, it gets tighter over here, and you learn to really know the landscape and the topography of these knots intimately well,
Hmm.
and it becomes an object, almost of obsession, and rightly so, because like you don't know what to do, and you're
Yeah, you
trying to
don't.
figure this out, and where am I supposed to
Yeah.
go? So at
Yeah.
first it was like, well, what do you mean all my beautiful little knots aren't special? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like, and then of course later, yeah, it was a huge comfort when it sort of clicked for me that a lot of these things that I have, we complicate our own stories maybe more than we need to sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think again, that's partly when we're trying to, do this autopsy on how did I get here, then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, and I had this kind of mother and that kind of father, and then there's that embarrassing thing that happened, and you kind of put this all together, and it becomes something that feels really unique. But if you can step back and realize that the main themes of how you get into the mess and the main themes of how you get out of it are kind of the same over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
then it's no longer an intellectual or an intellectual task, and it more becomes about how do I, one day at a time is what they say in 12-step
Yeah.
world. I think breaking things down to, or what is the next right thing for me to do? That's
Mm.
all that is just different ways of saying, how can I relocate myself into the present and
That's
focus
so
on
good.
what can be done right now? Um, versus what should have happened or shouldn't have happened back then, or what I hope might happen in the future, or what all of that kind of stuff is the place where we get really lost, and you can get caught in fear, or you can caught in anger and grievance and all of that stuff. And
Yeah.
that's fine to
Yeah.
explore all those feelings, but get
Yeah.
yourself out of the fire first, right?
That's so good, Cooper. Like, yes, it's normal to get caught in that. I know what I did for a while. It's kind of like this unpacking of some things and maybe grieving some negative realities that need to be done.
Yeah.
So it's not this simplistic formula.
Hmm.
We humans are complex. And I love when we allow the complexity and hold that. And there can be some simple ways out of this as well, you know? So thank you for saying that, Cooper, because, like I'm starting to hear some pushback on some of Gabor Mate's work. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with his work.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm starting to hear some pushback, which I think is always healthy. I think we need we need the balance of that, because his theory is really like ADHD is because of adverse childhood experiences.
Hmm.
Um, and then we've got others saying, well, it's more complex than that, you know, and we've got some research and we've got, some data, some scientific data and some long-term big studies,
Yeah.
talking about how there can be strong genetic factors when it comes to ADHD. And, how can we I have four sons, and I loved what you
Hmm.
said earlier. Like, I became convinced when my children were younger, like, I'm not sure our public school education or a lot of our educational systems really meet the needs
Hmm.
of boys. I didn't have any daughters, so I couldn't evaluate that for them. But for my sons, they were very kinesthetic. Three of them were very energetic, physical. Now, I had one who could sit quietly and love to learn, and that was how he was wired. But the other three really weren't. And so they were diagnosed. I started having teachers say, oh, they're probably ADD, and, you need to look at medicine. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there aren't long-term studies on how these medications will affect my sons long-term. And when they're out playing and able to move and breathe and have some space, they're perfectly lovely.
Hmm.
So, how can I help provide places that might help them? And not that I found all the answers to that. And how can I sit with them and help teach them some greater impulse
Hmm.
control, how to slow down, how to help them focus instead of just leaving them on their own to figure that out,
Hmm.
and to try to help them with those things. I know one time I had a couple of mine tested, and the psychologist who was testing them said, oh, he's super ADHD, but he has the best impulse control I've ever seen of any child. And I'm like, well, I mean, maybe it's probably because sit with him for like 2 hours a night, and
Hmm.
and we do his schoolwork that he couldn't do during the day. We just do it together at night. And even if
Hmm.
I get up, because like I love to multitask, women with a bunch of kids, that's what we do, right? So
Yeah.
I'd love to pop up, put the towels in the dryer. I'd totally lose him if I do that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to learn to be as focused as he needs to learn how to be focused. And so it's kind
Yeah.
of like a training for me too, because I probably could bounce around, you know? So uh, it's more complex than just adverse childhood, although I think that can be part of it, but it's not the
Yeah.
whole solution. So anyway, I want to know what you think because you're the expert here on this, not me. So tell me your thoughts on some of that.
Well, I wouldn't, yeah, I'm hesitant to call myself an expert because I don't for a variety of reasons. But what I will
Yeah.
say is that I'm somebody who has had my own experiences, and then since then I have had the privilege of working with a number of families, and mostly boys or teenagers or young men
Yeah.
who are looking at maybe different ways to understand the ADD, ADHD experience, or
Yeah.
and um and so just
I
based on that,
appreciate Cooper. I just want to pause for a second. I appreciate that you said that. I love that. Like, hey, I don't consider myself an expert. And I'm like, I appreciate that. Like, it's best when we can all stay like a humble learner. I'm just trying to
yeah,
understand. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
and I think a lot of I think a lot on this sort of thing in particular, when we talk about what does it mean to have expertise in ADD or ADHD, what does it mean to have expertise in mental health? You often have this presumption in the general public that a psychiatrist, for
yeah.
example, is an expert on the human condition. And that's not, there are no psychiatrists who would claim to, well, maybe very few psychiatrists who would claim to be that.
Right.
And
Right.
and they're experts on psychiatric treatment. That's the expertise that is
Yeah.
conferred by that training. And yet the presumption when it comes to mental health, because we do need to have a sense of where is the line between normal and abnormal? Like, when does a quirk of personality become a defect
Yeah.
of character, or when does a defect of character cross over into a personality disorder, right?
Yeah.
So there is a lot of the terminology we use to describe our own experiences or describe this that we see in the people around us does come from the world of academic and scientific expertise.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's always more fruitful if
Hmm.
you are not engaged in this stuff as a professional who needs to engage with very precise terminology from a very particular standpoint. We need to all get better at actually using language to describe these things. Because
That's
if
so
you
good.
say, oh, well, I have anxiety, that tells the people around you exactly nothing
That's true.
about you, right? But if you say, when I'm in the grocery store,
Hmm.
I feel, this fluttery feeling, but you can
Hmm.
actually use words to describe it. And if you do that out of the gates, there's a lot more opportunity for connection and discussion. Whereas as soon as you say like, well, I have, depression, a lot of people at that point say, well, I better not go in, I better not say anything because I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. And depression
Yeah.
is a disease, and that's for professionals only. So that's
Yeah.
just an aside. And I think we as lay people, and
Hmm.
you're in between those two roles. So I'm sure this is, something familiar to do. But those of us who are operating purely from the perspective of their own experience in life, I
Yeah.
think it's really useful for us to remember that our expertise, if we have expertise, is that experience plus some level of like diligence and ongoing curiosity in relationship to it,
Mhm.
so that whatever lessons you are able to derive from your own personal experience, that's contextualized in the personal experiences of other people who have
Mhm.
likely had something totally different, and what helped
Mhm.
one person is maybe really harmful to someone else. So all that being said,
Yeah. Yeah.
this whole question with ADHD, and I think that where the trauma model, which has, it's sort of like ballooned in popularity. And now I think we're starting to see more of a retraction in that, just
Mhm.
like, things come and go. I,
Mhm.
I think I agree with you that my attitude is this: we
Mhm.
all have traumas.
Mhm.
Some are quite significant and can be
Yes.
disabling. For
Yes.
other people, maybe something that was mild maybe somebody had about an embarrassing experience in high
Yes.
school that if I had had, I wouldn't have thought about it for longer than 24 hours. I would have moved on. But
Mhm.
somebody else, like it's burned into their memory, like every moment of some, what for someone else would be a mildly embarrassing experience becomes
Yeah.
traumatic. I
Yeah.
think it's really hard to even to try and like create categories
Mhm.
of like how much what is significant trauma versus a little
Mhm.
trauma, or like when
Mhm.
little traumas extend over a long period of time and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
let's just assume that everybody is walking around with some amount of effect from traumas they've experienced. And so the degree to which those traumas are going to end up manifesting on a day-to-day level that could
Mhm.
interfere with your ability to function in life, um, is totally about what other skills do you have to bear in relationship to those areas where you're coming up
Mhm.
short? What supports do you have in the people around you? Or what I did in my case is, I spent the first half of my life, or the first half of my adult life, thinking, how can I change myself to fit my environment?
Mm.
And I've spent the latter half focused on the opposite. What can I do to affect my environment and where I am and what I'm responsible for and who I have around me to help
Mhm.
me get stuff done? How can I adapt that to who I am naturally at baseline?
Mhm.
Right.
Wow.
And that's, I think, something that can be quite a strategic realm
Mm.
of thinking that is not even remotely medical, right?
No,
That's
you're
not the
right.
realm of psychiatry.
No.
That's more like coaching type stuff. But
Yes.
even just if you can find mentorship, if you can find a community of people who have thought along those lines for themselves, it helps
Mhm.
to know where you can find people who have needed to reinvent themselves sort of midway through adulthood.
Mhm.
Because if you find any community of people like that, you're going to find people who have thought deeply about what works and what doesn't when you're trying
Yeah.
to. Reinvention is not in my experience, it's not about becoming somebody new.
Mm-mm.
It's about finding a new place in the world for someone who was there the whole time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that can feel very new if
That's
you
right.
stop putting yourself into situations for which you're not well built or that are
Mhm.
triggering or otherwise just like are working against, your inborn strengths and abilities.
Mhm.
Um, I think a lot of people assume like I'm gonna go away and come back a new person. And that I've never seen that once happen ever. It's
No.
just not how it
No.
works. But you could think about where do you want to position the person you've always been so
That's
that
right.
the parts that work well are really shining and the
Yeah.
parts where you have more trouble, the amount of trouble they can cause you is minimized to a degree. Take some responsibility for those in advance.
Oh, Cooper, so well said. I, I, when I was listening to you, I was thinking, oh, we become more descriptive than prescriptive. Like you gave that example of, well, I have anxiety. It's like, well, let's slow down. Let's describe what happens and when does that happen, and what do you tell yourself in those moments, and is this maybe a trigger for you that got started a long time ago? Let's describe those things instead of prescribe that you've got anxiety. It's like we all feel anxiety at times. What if we like learned how to name those things so we can tame them, help our, they say in neuroscience that when we can describe, when our left brain will describe and name what we are experiencing and feeling, it will help
Hmm.
it'll help tame that right emotional brain. And then we can reconnect with our prefrontal cortex, and then our governor, or that, like you said, the strategic part of our brain can help us make
Hmm.
make better decisions. when we get
Mhm.
stuck in prescriptive, like I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm worried all the time. It's like, well, hey, I love to do this with people. Well, let's slow that down. Describe that to me and describe when that happens and tell me what's going on inside of your body and what are you saying to yourself in those moments? Like, how can we build skills around this?
Yeah.
So that really, I think what you're saying is so brilliant. It's not that we're setting out to be this new person. It's like maybe we're getting some of the things out of the way so you can become more like your true person. You know what I
Right.
mean? Who was there all along, but then life happens and
Yeah.
expectations. I used to say to my sons, like, guys, don't worry too much about how your grades are. And they say that males don't really kick in academically until they're about 21. So
Yeah.
just give yourself some time to grow into it. Like, don't put all this pressure on yourselves.
Yeah.
There can be so much pressure to be
Yeah.
something that maybe you're not. Like, you strike me as I see your guitar in the background, your books. I'm like, you strike me as a thoughtful, deep thinker, you know?
Try. Thanks
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I mean, I don't know. To me, that's like, and the work you're doing and the nonprofit, you want to help people find their inner, yeah, your inner compass. Isn't that the name of the
hmm
nonprofit? Yeah. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, well, that takes some depth where we're like cultivating our own souls,
Yeah.
instead of sometimes I think, Cooper, do you ever think this? Like, I think we live now in a very ADHD world where
Oh
it's
my God. It's
right. And I think we're all
it's
affected by it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think a lot in terms of y- I try it for what I shy away from a lot of like biological analysis
Yeah.
of human struggle because I think not that there's not biological components, but it's just like that's the one part of this that we actually have the least amount of control over.
Yeah.
So I don't know why, But that being said, my own worldview is that we are, to some degree, the human body, the human organism is a product of an evolutionary process of some kind. And the world for which we are optimized to thrive in is so vastly different than the one that we live in today.
Yes.
We are meant to probably meet maybe 38 people in our entire lives,
Mm.
right?
Wow.
We're
Yeah.
we're not we're meant to spend a lot of time surviving and trying to survive. We are not
Hmm.
built for a world of total abundance,
Mm. Yeah.
of, refrigerators that are always on.
Yeah.
Like we don't, and I'm not advocating for people to starve, although intermittent fasting was big, useful for me. But I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm
Me too.
saying
Yeah.
we don't have to think about a lot of the things that our brains are quite like optimized to be thinking about, which is where am I going to get my next meal, even though I haven't had one in a day and a half.
Yeah.
That's kind of um, lifestyle. It
Hmm.
it's you have the physical lifestyle, but then
Yeah.
you're also not meant. And up until what, 10 or 15 years ago,
Yeah.
who could have imagined being able to live a single day in a reality where every single person you ever met in your entire life could message you
Yeah. Oh my
24
gosh.
hours a day and
You're
say
right.
who knows what? And we
Yeah.
have just jumped in with both feet into this framework where everything that we say is captured somewhere.
Yeah.
Every stupid idea that we've ever had is out there somewhere. I have 5,000 tweets out there in the ether. Who
Yeah.
knows
I know.
what's there? And I think as
Yeah.
a culture, we're getting better at not like actually using that stuff against each other, but on some level, psychologically, we're still walking around like dragging behind us the endless quantity of stuff we've said and places we've gone and photos we've taken and people we've met and connections on LinkedIn and connections on Facebook and all of this stuff that
Mhm.
if you close the computer, if the
Yeah.
power goes out,
Yeah.
all that is poof,
Yeah.
gone. And
Yeah.
then what are you left with? Something that a lot of us have been so out of touch with.
Mhm.
We are so out of touch with who we are outside of our screens. And
Yeah.
I think that technology has created enormous opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'm not somebody who's just like anti-internet or anything like that, but I do think that as a civilization, our ability to form a culture and an etiquette around the proper use of this stuff is
Yeah.
about 2 generations behind
Oh, yeah.
where the technology is. And it's going to take a while for us to catch up. But I imagine, it won't be long before like even just taking your phone out when you're,
Mm.
you know, uh, having a conversation in real life with other people it will be as socially unacceptable as like farting or lighting a cigarette, right?
Wouldn't that be lovely, Cooper? That would be lovely. I
I think we're
know.
going there. I see, especially younger people, I see
Yeah.
are the ones who are just who've grown up so stuck in this stuff. They're the ones who often see most clearly this is not important or worthwhile.
Oh my gosh. And as humans, I think we're meant to walk through the forest and put our feet in the ocean and walk on the sand and you know what I mean? Go float in a lake. And we're so removed from that and we're so rushed.
Yeah.
And it's like, and you're right, we're all staring at our screens and not looking into each other's eyes deeply. And it is costing us so much. So thank you for, I like that we kind of went off on that little tangent for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Well, Cooper, man, we could talk for days. I
Yeah.
really appreciate that you sharing your story with us. And I know we just got tidbits of it. So I hope you'll come back and we can do
Oh,
this
please.
again.
This would be great. You're such a pleasant person to talk to, Nancy, and it's
Oh,
so
thank
nice
you.
also. Sometimes you know, when you talk about this stuff the way that I sometimes do,
Yeah.
you end up on interviews with people who are kind of hostile. So it is really nice
Mm.
to be here with you.
Oh, yeah.
Like where I don't feel like you're, waiting to stick the knife in.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
it does, it's so important to be able to talk about, these alternative ways of thinking around
Yeah.
these really important issues
Yeah.
without adding that extra emotional or combative charge that I think a lot of people
Mm.
are primed to do, right?
Well, I mean, I'm just like, gosh, Cooper, I can't see any reason why anybody would want to stick a knife in you. That's just sad and pitiful, because you are so delightful and man, the desire to, take what was really hard for you and to share that with others, that's what isn't that the last step in AA? Like, hey, turn around now and give it to others. It's that
Yeah,
social responsibility, which we now know is a big part of emotional
yeah,
intelligence.
yeah,
Like, hey, this worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you. I'm not saying it will. I'm not going to give you three magic steps, and
yeah.
I don't have a magic wand, and everything's going to be hunky dory in your life. It's not that simple. But I'm willing to share with you what has been helpful. And I love that. I think that's people loving and caring for people. And isn't that really, why we're here?
It
you know?
sure is. That was the biggest change for me in the way I used to live and the way I live now. Um, it's not like I don't continue to have frustrations and problems, some of them quite big, some
Yeah.
of them quite hard to solve. But the
Yeah.
difference is I now know that at any moment I can choose to focus on being of service to the world around me. And all
Mm.
of a sudden, my problems are not the most important problems in my head, right? That now
There you go.
there's room for unlimited other problems of
Yeah.
your own sort of start to diminish once you kind of take on other stuff that's elsewhere. And I think that's some people knew that like from the get-go. I had to learn the hard way the value in being of service to other people and how in a lot of ways it's the best thing you can do for yourself is getting out of your own head, right?
Oh man, that is so good. And isn't it great to know that our failures can be our greatest successes because they can lead us to humility. and,
Mm-hmm.
and some of our greatest successes actually lead us to our greatest failures because it leads us to pride. It's
Yeah.
like, oh man, life is so much sweeter when we can just, kind of like be humble and like, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't have all the answers by any means. So I love that you and I are the non-experts here.
Mm-hmm.
just trying to have human conversations and maybe, what we've gone through can help some other people is our greatest
Yeah.
desire. And it's a lot of fun,
Yeah.
right?
It is, it can be. It can
Yeah,
be.
it
And
can be.
next time you have me on, Nancy, I would love for us to talk about virtues and
Ooh.
vices and
Ooh.
about, because I just hear you talking about pride and all this stuff. And I think that virtues, the idea of virtues have gotten like a bad rap lately, and they've
Yeah.
been they've been kind of pushed out, certainly of mental health language, but there is an incredible wisdom in what sort of traditionally there's literally a list of virtues and there and the vice that sort of negative reflection of those virtues and
Ooh.
courage is the ultimate virtue. And I didn't know, I knew what resilience was, but only when things were really hard and resilience was no longer enough did I actually step into this idea of courage, which anyway, I could go on and on, but I feel like we could
Wow.
have a really interesting conversation about um the idea that there's a whole lineage and history of thinking about and talking about virtue that kind
Wow.
of just got pushed out of the discussion at
Totally,
some point
Cooper.
in the last
Yeah.
couple decades.
100%. Oh my gosh, I love that you said that. And I love that there is sort of maybe this swelling desire that we get back in touch with what are the virtues. I'm
Yeah.
reading an excellent book right now called The Road to Character by David Brooks. And, he's a well known journalist. And
Hmm.
he said, I wrote this book to save me.
Beautiful.
Because I've been in, I can be, he's, the work he does. He said, this is what he said. It's not what I'm saying about him. He said, the work I do I can come across like a narcissistic blowhard. And he said, I thought that was so cute. What a great confession,
Yeah.
right? But like, so he wrote this beautiful book on character. And,
Hmm.
he talks about a Jewish rabbi who talked to him about Adam 1 and Adam 2. And Adam 1 is the driven, conquer, succeed. And Adam 2 is about this part of us that needs to seek the redemption of our souls and to think about how do we build our own character. And
Hmm.
that and my conclusion was, and maybe David said this, I don't know, but was that, oh, Adam 2 is meant to guide Adam 1, not vice versa. And
Hmm.
and when we can allow our Adam 2 and we've been working on cultivating our character, our soul, our, the virtues, as you say, then that can steer our Adam 1 much better than when Adam 1 tries to steer Adam 2. So
Hmm.
anyway, thank you for saying that. And yes, oh my gosh, I want to do this tomorrow, but I know we both have things to do. So we will schedule this virtue and vices conversation as soon as we can. And thank you for being such a delightful guest.
Well,
I
thank you for
really,
having me, Nancy.
yeah. Oh, I really appreciate you. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to my guest. I just hope that this has been helpful, maybe even inspirational, maybe given you some needed courage that you are a human of value and worth, and your life and your future has value and worth. And if you're stuck in a cycle that is not working for you, hey, you're worth getting the, maybe borrowing some courage from others to help you to start moving forward into the life that you want to have. Not that it's all going to be rosy, not that it's all going to be peachy. It's not. Life is hard. Um, and you're up for it. So let's
Mm.
just do this together. Thank you for listening. If this was helpful, please like it, subscribe it, share it with your friends, your family. Go to Cooper's website, innercompass.org, and gain some from what Cooper's story is and other stories. And hey, I love you and thanks for being with us today. Bye bye.
I